The explosion came without warning, a thunderclap beneath the waves that shattered Klaus Richter's world into fragments of twisted metal and screaming water. In the crushing darkness of the Atlantic depths, 40 meters below the surface where sunlight had never touched these steel walls, U-247 shuddered like a dying whale. The submarine's hull groaned against the immense pressure, rivets popping with the sharp crack of rifle shots, and Klaus felt his ears burst from the concussion that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Mein Gott," whispered Oberleutnant Hans Müller, the navigation officer, whose steady hands now trembled as he gripped the periscope housing. His pale blue eyes, which had guided them safely through a dozen convoy attacks, now reflected only terror and confusion. What was that? There was no depth charge pattern, no warning sonar pings, nothing. Klaus pressed his palm against a bleeding gash on his forehead, the warm blood mixing with the condensation that perpetually dripped from the submarine ceiling. As the boat's chief engineer, he had lived through depth charge attacks before. The methodical dropping of explosive barrels that would detonate at preset depths, sending shockwaves through the water in predictable patterns. You could hear them coming, count the seconds, brace for impact. But this was different. This was instantaneous death reaching down from above with surgical precision. The emergency lighting bathed everything in hellish red as Kapitänleutnant Weber stumbled through the control room, his usually immaculate uniform torn and stained with hydraulic fluid. At 34, Weber was young for a U-boat commander, but his iron nerves had earned him the Knight's Cross and the respect of every man aboard. Now those same nerves seemed frayed to breaking point. "Damage report," Weber barked, his voice cutting through the chaos of hissing steam and crackling electrical fires. "All stations, report." Klaus forced himself to focus, running through his mental checklist of the boat's vital systems. The diesel engines had shut down automatically when they crash dived, but the electric motors that drove them underwater were making an ominous grinding sound. "Main ballast tank 3 is ruptured, Herr Kalu. We're taking on water faster than the pumps can handle. Hull integrity is compromised in sections 4 and 7. From the torpedo room came the voice of Oberboatsman Erich Hoffmann, a grizzled veteran whose weathered face had seen the North Atlantic claim too many good men. "Forward tubes 1 and 3 are flooded, but we can't determine if it's from battle damage or the dive. The compressed air system is showing massive pressure loss." Weber grabbed the speaking tube that connected to the engine room. "Maschinenmott Fischer, what's our power situation?" The crackling response came through layers of static. "Battery compartment shows signs of chlorine gas from seawater contamination, Herr Kalu. We're running on emergency power only, maybe 30 minutes before complete electrical failure." Klaus felt the submarine's angle shift beneath his feet as they continued their uncontrolled descent. The depth gauge showed 60 meters and climbing, or rather falling. At this rate, they would reach crush depth within minutes. The crush hull of a Type 7C U-boat like theirs was rated to 200 meters in theory, but Klaus knew that battle damage could reduce that safety margin to nothing. "Sir," Müller called from the hydrophone station, his voice tight with disbelief, "I'm detecting multiple contacts above us, British destroyers, at least 3, maybe 4. They're not dropping depth charges, they're just waiting." Weber moved to the periscope well, though at this depth it was useless. His hands, which had been steady through countless surface attacks, now clenched and unclenched rhythmically. Waiting for what?
That was the question that would haunt Klaus through the next terrible hours. The Royal Navy had been hunting U-boats with increasing effectiveness throughout 1943, but their tactics were predictable. Depth charges required time to sink and arm, giving submarines precious seconds to maneuver. Sonar pulses announced their presence like lighthouse beams in the dark. But this attack had come from nowhere, with no warning, no signature that their hydrophones could detect. Klaus thought of the letter in his breast pocket, written but never sent, to his wife Maria in Hamburg. She was pregnant with their first child, due in the winter when he was supposed to return from this patrol. He had written about the changing nature of the war, how the British seemed to know where every U-boat would be before they arrived. Admiral Donitz called it bad luck or betrayed codes, but Klaus suspected something more sinister. "Herr Kaleu," came Fisher's voice through the speaking tube, more urgent now. "The hull is starting to buckle in the engine room. I can see stress fractures forming along the main structural beams." 100 meters. 110. The submarine groaned like a living thing in pain, and Klaus could hear the sound of metal under impossible stress, a low, harmonious moan that seemed to come from the boat's very soul. Through the red emergency lighting, he could see water beginning to seep through hairline cracks in the pressure hull, tiny streams that would soon become torrents. Oberboatsman Huffman appeared in the control room, his oil stand coveralls soaked with seawater. At 52, he was the oldest man aboard, a veteran of the First World War who had served on surface ships before volunteering for the U-boat service. His presence had always been calming to the younger crew members, a reminder that they were not alone in their iron coffin beneath the waves. "Sir," Hoffman said quietly to Weber, "we need to discuss our options." Weber nodded grimly. The options were few, and none of them good. They could continue the descent until the hull collapsed, killing all 47 men aboard instantly. They could attempt to surface into the guns of waiting British destroyers, where death might be slower but no less certain. Or they could try something that had never been attempted before, a controlled ascent using only the forward ballast tanks, hoping to reach shallow water where they might have a chance of survival. Klaus found himself thinking about the weapon that had nearly destroyed them. Whatever it was, it had struck with pinpoint accuracy and devastating force. The British had always been methodical in their anti-submarine warfare, but this suggested a new level of precision that terrified him. If they could strike without warning, without the telltale signature of depth charges, then no submarine was safe. "Müller," Weber said, "set up a communication schedule with BDU." BDU, Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, was U-boat command, Admiral Donitz's headquarters from which the Battle of the Atlantic was directed. "If we survive the next hour, headquarters needs to know about this new weapon." Müller nodded and began adjusting the radio frequencies, though Klaus doubted any signal would penetrate to the surface from their current depth. The submarine's communication equipment was sophisticated by 1943 standards, but it was not designed to operate under these conditions. 120 meters. The depth gauge needle continued its relentless climb toward their doom. Klaus could feel the water pressure pressing against the hull like the fist of an angry god, seeking any weakness, any flaw in their steel sanctuary. The temperature in the submarine was rising as the circulation systems failed, and the air was growing thick with the smell of burning insulation and the sharp tang of chlorine gas from the flooded battery compartments. "Sir," Fisher's voice came through the speaking tube one final time, "you need to see this." Weber and Klaus made their way aft to the engine room, moving carefully through the tilted corridors as the submarine continued its descent. What they found there would change everything Klaus thought he knew about the war beneath the waves. The hull plating along the starboard side was not just cracked, it was punctured by what appeared to be multiple small holes, each no larger than a man's fist, arranged in a precise pattern. The edges of the holes were torn inward, as if something had struck from outside with tremendous force. But there were no fragments of depth charge casings, no evidence of the kind of explosive damage that conventional weapons would cause. "This is impossible," Klaus whispered, running his fingers along the edge of one of the holes. The metal was still warm to the touch. "Depth charges don't do this kind of damage. They create massive pressure waves that buckle hulls. But this looks like we were hit by multiple projectiles." Weber examined the damage pattern with the eye of a professional warrior. Concentrated, accurate fire. But from what? And how did they know exactly where to aim? That question would haunt every U-boat crew in the Atlantic as word of the new British weapon spread through the submarine fleet. The Hedgehog mortar, as it would come to be known, represented a revolution in anti-submarine warfare. A weapon that fired multiple projectiles in a preset pattern, each one designed to explode only on contact with the submarine's hull. Unlike depth charges, which gave submarines time to maneuver and often missed their targets entirely, the Hedgehog was merciless in its accuracy. But Klaus and his crewmates knew none of this as U-247 continued its death spiral toward the crushing depths of the Atlantic. All they knew was that the rules of underwater warfare had changed, and they were among the first to experience the terror of a weapon that struck like lightning from a clear sky. 3 months earlier, Kapitänleutnant Weber had stood on the conning tower of U-247 in the Biscay dawn, watching the French coast disappear into the morning mist. The submarine base at Lorient was already a memory, its massive concrete bunkers and floating dry docks fading into the distance as they headed west into the hunting grounds of the North Atlantic. The sea was calm that morning, an unusual blessing in waters notorious for their temperamental moods, and Weber felt the familiar surge of confidence that came with taking his boat to sea. Klaus Richter had been part of Weber's crew for 18 months, long enough to understand the complex rhythms of submarine warfare. As chief engineer, he was responsible for the intricate mechanical systems that kept their steel tube habitable beneath the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. Every morning at sea
began the same way, a methodical inspection of the diesel engines, the electric motors, the maze of pipes and valves that circulated air, water, and fuel throughout the boat's cramped interior. The crew of 47 men lived in spaces that would have been cramped for half that number. Each man had a bunk barely wide enough for his shoulders, stacked 3 high and compartments that doubled as storage areas and workspaces. Privacy was a luxury that did not exist aboard a U-boat. Every conversation could be overheard. Every personal habit became common knowledge. Every fear and hope shared among men who depended on each other for survival. Klaus had grown up in Bremen, where his father worked in the shipyards building merchant vessels that would later be sunk by the very submarines his son served aboard. The irony was not lost on him, but war had a way of making philosophers of ordinary men. He had joined the Kriegsmarine in 1940, drawn by the promise of adventure and the glamour that surrounded the U-boat service in the early days of the war. The Gray Wolves, they called themselves, and in those first years it had seemed an appropriate name. They were predators in a vast ocean, hunting the merchant ships that carried Britain's lifeblood across the Atlantic. But by 1943, Klaus had begun to suspect that the hunters were becoming the hunted. Oberboatsman Erich Hoffmann had served aboard surface ships during the First World War, and his stories of that earlier conflict provided a sobering perspective on their current situation. "The British learn from every mistake," he would tell the younger crew members during the long, boring hours of surface transit. "They lost thousands of ships to U-boats between 1914 and 1918, but they also learned how to fight back. Sonar, depth charges, convoy escorts, they didn't have any of that in the beginning." Hoffmann's weathered hands would gesture as he spoke, illustrating points with the unconscious skill of a born storyteller. "The difference is they have the whole bloody Royal Navy to throw at us now. We have maybe 300 operational boats, and half of them are in port at any given time. They have thousands of destroyers, corvettes, frigates, and aircraft. The mathematics are not in our favor." Klaus had tried not to think about the mathematics. The official casualty reports from BDU were classified, but rumors spread through the submarine service with the speed of wildfire. Entire flotillas had disappeared in the past year, their fates unknown until weeks later when fragments of wreckage washed ashore, where survivors were pulled from lifeboats. The average life expectancy of a U-boat crew was measured in months now, not years. Oberleutnant Hans Müller, the navigation officer, approached the war with the methodical precision of a chess master. His charts covered every square kilometer of the North Atlantic, marked with colored pins that showed convoy routes, weather patterns, and areas of known British patrol activity. Müller could plot an intercept course in his head, calculating speed, bearing, and fuel consumption with the accuracy of a mechanical computer. "The convoys are getting larger," Müller observed one evening as they cruised on the surface, charging their batteries under a canopy of brilliant stars. HX-229 had over 40 ships, SC-122 had 51. but they're also getting better escorts, more destroyers, more aircraft coverage, better radar. The word radar was spoken with particular reverence and fear among U-boat crews. The British had developed shipborne radar sets that could detect a submarine's conning tower at distances of several kilometers, even in complete darkness. The days of surfacing with impunity to attack convoys at night were rapidly coming to an end. Klaus remembered their first encounter with British radar during a patrol in February. They had been stalking a convoy southwest of Ireland, running submerged during the day and surfacing at night to maintain contact. Weber had brought them to the surface just after midnight, expecting to find the convoy silhouetted against the horizon. Instead, they found themselves illuminated by a searchlight from a British destroyer that had been waiting for them in the darkness. "Alarm!" Weber had shouted, and Klaus had felt the familiar lurch in his stomach as the submarine went into a crash dive. The destroyer's guns had opened fire before they were fully submerged, shells whistling overhead and splashing into the water around them. It had been a close thing, closer than Klaus cared to remember. The psychological impact of that encounter had been profound. For the first time, Klaus realized that they were no longer the invisible predators of the deep. The British could see them coming, track their movements, anticipate their attacks. The ocean, which had once been their ally and sanctuary, was becoming a trap. Life aboard U-247 followed routines that had been established through necessity and tradition. The crew was divided into 2 watches, with half the men on duty at any given time, while the others slept, ate, or performed maintenance tasks. Klaus's domain was the engine room, a maze of machinery that required constant attention and care. The twin diesel engines that drove them on the surface were temperamental beasts that consumed fuel, oil, and spare parts at an alarming rate. The electric motors that powered their submerged operations were more reliable, but had limited endurance.
Every morning, Klaus would begin his day by checking the fuel tanks, oil levels, battery charge, and the dozens of other systems that kept their submarine operational. The work was methodical and familiar, providing a sense of normalcy in an environment where nothing was truly normal. He took pride in maintaining his machinery, knowing that the lives of his crewmates depended on every bolt, valve, and electrical connection being in perfect working order. The food aboard U-247 was adequate but monotonous. Fresh provisions lasted only a few days at sea, after which the crew subsisted on canned goods, preserved meats, and hardtack. The cook, Matros Heinrich Bauer, was a miracle worker who could transform the most unpromising ingredients into meals that were at least edible. His galley was a tiny space forward of the torpedo room, equipped with a single stove and barely enough room for one man to work. "The secret," Bauer would explain to anyone who asked, "is not to think too hard about what you're eating. Focus on the taste, not the source." Klaus had learned not to ask too many questions about the contents of their rations. The labels on the cans were often illegible, and some of the preserved meats had a suspicious texture that defied identification. But hunger was a powerful motivator, and after a few weeks at sea, even the most questionable meal became acceptable. The crew's morale was maintained through a combination of discipline, camaraderie, and a shared knowledge that they were all in the same predicament. Weber was a fair but demanding commander who expected excellence from every man aboard his boat. He led by example, working alongside his crew during emergencies and never asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Mueller provided intellectual stimulation through his extensive library of books, which he shared freely with anyone interested in reading. The navigation officer had a particular fondness for philosophy and history, and his evening discussions with other crew members often ranged far beyond the immediate concerns of submarine warfare. Hoffman was the boat's unofficial father figure, a man whose experience and wisdom were sought by crew members dealing with personal problems or professional challenges. He had a gift for listening and an uncanny ability to provide practical advice that helped men cope with the stresses of their dangerous profession. Klaus found himself thinking often of his wife Maria and the child she was carrying. Her letters, when they reached him through the irregular mail service that connected submarines to the outside world, were filled with news of rationing, air raids, and the thousand small hardships that defined life on the German home front. She worked in a munitions factory now, 12 hours a day, producing shells and bullets for the war effort. "I dream of you every night," she had written in her last letter, which had reached him just before they left Lorient. "I dream of walking with you through the Stadt Park, showing our child the swans on the pond and the flowers in the botanical garden. I dream of peace and quiet Sunday mornings when the only sound is church bells, not air raid sirens." That letter Klaus carried in his breast pocket, next to his heart, and read during quiet moments when the submarine was running submerged and his duties allowed him a few minutes of privacy. The paper was already showing signs of wear from constant folding and unfolding, but the words remained as precious to him as any treasure. The technical aspects of submarine warfare had evolved dramatically during Klaus's service. When he first joined the crew of U-247, their tactics were relatively straightforward. Locate a convoy, maneuver into attack position, fire torpedoes, and escape in the confusion that followed. The torpedoes themselves were a marvel of engineering, self-propelled weapons that could travel several kilometers underwater and explode against the hull of an enemy ship with devastating effect. But the British had learned to counter these tactics. Their escort vessels now carried sophisticated sonar equipment that could detect a submerged submarine at considerable distances. Their depth charges were more powerful and more accurately aimed. Their aircraft patrolled the convoy routes with increasing frequency, forcing U-boats to remain submerged for extended periods at a time. Most disturbing of all were the reports of new British weapons that seemed to strike without warning. Klaus had heard rumors from other submarine crews about attacks that came suddenly with devastating accuracy, giving no time for evasive action or emergency procedures. The weapons left damage patterns that were unlike anything produced by conventional depth charges, suggesting that the British had developed something entirely new. "They're getting better at killing us," Hoffman observed during one of their evening discussions. "The question is whether we're getting better at staying alive." It was a question that haunted Klaus as U-247 continued its patrol through the dangerous waters of the North Atlantic. Every day brought new challenges and new reminders that the war beneath the waves was changing in ways that might prove fatal to them all. The first sign of the convoy appeared on their hydrophones just after dawn on March 15, 1943. Mueller's trained ear detected the rhythmic thrum of multiple propellers through the static and ocean noise that filled their underwater world. "Contact bearing 270, multiple screws, range approximately 12 kilometers," he reported quietly, his voice carrying the controlled excitement of a hunter who has spotted his prey. Klaus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied the beginning of an attack. After 3 weeks of fruitless patrolling in empty ocean, they had finally found what they were looking for. A convoy of merchant ships making their way across the Atlantic toward Britain, loaded with the materials that kept the British war effort alive. Fuel oil, steel, ammunition, aircraft parts, food, the lifeblood of a nation under siege. Weber moved to the periscope with the fluid grace of long practice. At battle stations, every man aboard knew his role, and the submarine transformed from a cramped living space into a precision instrument.
"War. Periscope depth," Weber ordered, and Klaus felt the boat rise smoothly through the dark water toward the distant surface. The convoy that filled Weber's periscope was massive, over 30 merchant ships arranged in columns that stretched across several kilometers of ocean. Tank ships and cargo vessels, some flying British flags, others showing the colors of neutral nations that were nonetheless carrying contraband to Britain. At the convoy's perimeter, Klaus could see the escorts, destroyers and corvettes whose job was to protect the merchantmen from exactly the kind of attack that U-247 was preparing to launch. "Mark the lead ship," Weber said calmly. "Looks like a tanker, 10,000 tons, range 4,000 meters." Mueller worked quickly at the torpedo data computer, a mechanical calculator that transformed target bearing, speed, and range into firing solutions for their weapons. The mathematics of underwater warfare were complex, requiring precise calculations of intercept courses and the time required for torpedoes to reach their targets. Klaus monitored his instruments as the submarine maneuvered into attack position. The electric motors that drove them while submerged were virtually silent, but they drew heavily on the batteries that had been charged during their night surface run. He watched the battery indicators carefully, knowing that their underwater endurance was measured in hours, not days. "Tubes 1 through 4, flood and open outer doors," Weber commanded. The torpedo room, located in the bow of the submarine, was where Oberbootsman Hoffman and his team prepared their primary weapons for launch. Each torpedo was over 7 meters long and carried a warhead containing 300 kilograms of explosive. They were guided by sophisticated gyroscopic systems that could maintain a preset course even if the submarine changed direction after firing. "Tubes 1 through 4 ready for firing, sir," came Hoffman's voice through the intercom. Weber studied his target through the periscope, waiting for the perfect moment when the tanker would be in optimal position for a successful attack. The convoy was zigzagging, changing course every few minutes to confuse submarine attacks, but Mueller's calculations had anticipated this evasive maneuver. "Fire 1, Weber's command echoed through the submarine. Klaus felt the slight shudder as the first torpedo left its tube, expelled by compressed air and immediately beginning its deadly journey toward the convoy. The torpedo's electric motor was nearly silent, giving the target no warning of the approaching weapon. "Fire 2, fire 3, fire 4. 4 torpedoes were now racing through the water toward the convoy, their paths carefully calculated to intersect with different targets. Klaus began the process of reloading the empty tubes, a complex operation that required the entire torpedo room crew and took nearly 30 minutes to complete. "All torpedoes running straight and normal," Mueller reported, monitoring the weapon's progress through his hydrophone equipment. The torpedo's motors generated a distinctive sound signature that could be tracked until they reached their targets. Weber kept the periscope raised, watching for the results of their attack. "Time to target 1 minute 40 seconds, he announced. Klaus counted the seconds, visualizing the torpedoes racing through the water toward their unsuspecting targets. The merchantmen had no idea that death was approaching from beneath the waves, their crews going about their normal duties while 4 high-explosive warheads closed the distance at 45 knots. The first explosion lit up the horizon like a miniature sunrise. Through the periscope, Weber watched as our lead torpedo struck the tanker amidships, sending a column of flame and smoke hundreds of meters into the air. The ship broke in half almost immediately, its cargo of aviation fuel feeding a fire that could be seen for kilometers. "Hit!" Weber called out, and I heard the cheer that went up throughout the submarine. The second explosion followed moments later as another torpedo found its mark, this time striking a cargo vessel that immediately began listing to starboard. But the convoy's escorts were already responding. Through his hydrophones, Mueller could hear the high-speed screws of destroyers turning toward their position, their sonar pulses beginning to probe the water around the submarine's last known location. "Take us down to 60 meters, Weber ordered. "Silent running." Klaus shut down all non-essential systems as the submarine descended into the safer depths. Silent running was a ballet of coordinated movements, with every man aboard knowing exactly how to minimize noise that might betray their position to the searching destroyers above. Even conversation was conducted in whispers during silent running, and crew members moved with exaggerated care to avoid dropping tools or banging equipment. The first depth charges detonated 10 minutes later, massive underwater explosions that sent shock waves through the ocean and rattled every bolt and rivet in U-247's hull. Klaus could feel the submarine shudder with each explosion, and he watched his instruments carefully for signs of damage to critical systems. "They're dropping a standard pattern," Mueller observed quietly. "Square search, depth settings probably 60 to 90 meters. Weber nodded grimly. The British had developed systematic techniques for depth charge attacks, dropping their weapons in geometric patterns designed to maximize the chance of damaging or destroying the submarine. The explosions were getting closer, and Klaus could hear fragments of steel raining down on their hull from the blasts above. But this was familiar warfare, dangerous but predictable. The destroyers would continue their search for several hours, dropping depth charges at suspected submarine positions, but eventually they would have to return to the convoy or risk running out of fuel. Klaus had survived dozens of similar attacks, and while they were always terrifying, they followed patterns that experienced submarine crews could anticipate and counter. What happened next was entirely unprecedented. The explosions came without warning, a series of sharp concussions that seemed to strike the submarine from directly above with surgical precision. Unlike depth charges, which created massive pressure waves that affected a large area, these explosions were focused and accurate. Klaus felt the submarine lurch as multiple impacts struck their hull in quick succession. "What the hell was that?" Weber demanded, grabbing the periscope housing for support as the submarine rolled from the impacts. Mueller, monitoring his instruments, looked confused and alarmed. "Sir, I detected no incoming weapons, no splashes, no sounds of depth charges being dropped. These explosions came from nowhere."
Klaus was already moving through the submarine, checking for damage from the mysterious attack. What he found in the forward torpedo room stopped him cold. The hull plating showed multiple punctures, small holes that appeared to have been made by high-velocity projectiles striking from above. But there were no fragments, no evidence of the kind of explosive warheads that would normally create such damage. "Herr Kalje," Klaus called through the intercom. "You need to see this." Weber and Mueller joined him in examining the damage, and their expressions reflected the same bewilderment that Klaus felt. This was not the work of depth charges or any anti-submarine weapon they had encountered before. "It's as if something fired multiple projectiles at us simultaneously," Weber mused, running his fingers along the edge of one of the holes. "But how could they achieve such accuracy without any kind of targeting signature?" Mueller checked his hydrophone equipment again, replaying the recordings of the attack. There was no sound of weapons being fired, no splash patterns, nothing to indicate incoming projectiles until they actually struck our hull. The implications were terrifying. If the British had developed a weapon that could strike submarines with pinpoint accuracy and without warning, then every U-boat in the Atlantic was in mortal danger. The traditional tactics of submarine warfare, diving deep, running silent, evading through maneuvering, would be useless against a weapon that seemed to know exactly where they were at all times. Klaus attempted emergency repairs while the submarine continued its evasive maneuvers, but the damage was more extensive than it first appeared. Several of the holes had punctured internal systems, and they were taking on water faster than their pumps could handle. Worse, the battery compartment had been flooded with seawater, creating the deadly risk of chlorine gas production. "We need to surface," Klaus reported grimly. "The damage is too extensive for underwater repairs, and we're losing battery power rapidly." Weber faced an impossible choice. Surfacing would expose them to the guns of the British escorts, but remaining submerged might mean death from the mysterious new weapon or from the gradual failure of their damaged systems. The mathematics of survival had become entirely unpredictable. "Surface the boat," Weber decided. "All ahead full. We'll try to outrun them on the surface." As U-247 broke through into the gray daylight of the North Atlantic, Klaus could see the convoy in the distance, two of its ships burning from their successful torpedo attack.
But he could also see the British escorts turning toward them with lethal intent, their guns already training on the submarine's exposed conning tower. The next few minutes would test every system Klaus had spent months maintaining and every skill the crew had learned through bitter experience. The diesel engines roared to life, pushing the submarine through the heavy seas at maximum speed, while the British destroyers closed the distance with their superior speed and firepower. Shell splashes erupted around them as the escort vessels opened fire, their guns seeking the range to the fleeing submarine. Klaus could hear the whistle of incoming shells and the crash of near misses that sent columns of water high into the air. One shell struck the water so close that the explosion showered the conning tower with fragments and seawater. "Dive! Emergency dive!" Weber shouted, as a salvo of shells bracketed their position. Klaus executed the emergency dive procedure with desperate speed, flooding the ballast tanks and driving the submarine beneath the surface just as the British shells began to find their range. They were barely 10 meters underwater when the next salvo arrived, the explosions close enough to rattle their teeth and crack several instrument gauges. But they had escaped, at least temporarily. The British escorts could not pursue them indefinitely, and eventually they would have to return to protect the convoy. U-247 limped away from the battle area, nursing her wounds and trying to make sense of the weapon that had nearly destroyed them. Over the following days, as they made their way back toward their base in France, Klaus worked around the clock to keep their damaged systems operational. The mysterious projectiles had caused more damage than initially apparent, and several critical systems were operating on the edge of failure. Mueller monitored radio transmissions from other U-boats, trying to gather intelligence about similar attacks. What they learned was deeply disturbing. U-221 had reported a similar encounter 3 days earlier, suffering multiple hull punctures from an unknown weapon system. U-403 had been less fortunate. Their last radio transmission described being under attack by multiple accurate projectiles before their signals went silent forever.
The British had developed something new, something that was changing the balance of power in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Grey Wolves were no longer the hunters. They had become the prey of a weapon system that seemed to strike with the precision of divine judgment. Klaus found himself thinking about the letters from home, about Maria and their unborn child, about the father he might never become if this war continued to escalate. The submarine service had always been dangerous, but the risks had been calculable. Now they faced an enemy with capabilities that seemed almost supernatural in their accuracy and lethality. As U-247 approached the submarine pens at Lorient, Klaus could see the concrete bunkers that provided protection from Allied air raids. The massive structures, built by forced labor and designed to withstand direct bomb hits, represented the German attempt to create an impregnable fortress for their submarine fleet. But Klaus wondered if any fortress could protect them from an enemy who seemed to know their exact position at all times. The debriefing session at BDU headquarters was conducted by officers who listened with growing concern to Weber's report of the mysterious weapon system. Similar accounts from other submarine commanders were being compiled and analyzed, but no clear picture had emerged of what they were facing. The British appeared to have developed a new type of anti-submarine mortar, concluded Corvettan Captain Heinrich Reisch, the intelligence officer responsible for analyzing enemy capabilities. It fires multiple projectiles in a predetermined pattern, each designed to explode only on contact with a submarine's hull. This eliminates the guesswork involved in setting depth charges to the correct depth. The implications were staggering. If the British could fire multiple projectiles simultaneously and achieve contact explosions, then submarines would no longer have the luxury of maneuvering between depth charge explosions. Every projectile that reached the correct depth would detonate against their hull with devastating effect. Klaus left the briefing session with a heavy heart, knowing that his next patrol would be even more dangerous than his last. The war beneath the waves was changing, and not in Germany's favor. The gray wolves were learning that evolution in warfare was a constant process, and those who failed to adapt quickly enough would not survive to learn from their mistakes.